The damp subterranean Genoese dungeon remained dimly lit. Inside, a man, his voice low but urgent, paced the small cell as he spoke. Across from him, his cellmate's quill scratched furiously, struggling to keep pace with this almost impossible tale. One of grand palaces made of pure gold, paper used as currency, and a court of thousands serving a quote-unquote great Khan. To the romance writer holding the quill, it was pure fantasy. But to the prisoner pacing the stone floor, it was simply his life. Hello, and welcome to Impactful Moments, where we explore some of the most, you guessed it, impactful moments in human history. In this video, we will chart the extraordinary journey of Marco Polo and the profound economic blueprint that bridged two vastly different worlds. In the wake of Rome's collapse, Western Europe was trapped in a bit of a bottleneck: subsistence feudalism. Splintered into isolated Germanic kingdoms, the vast majority of the continent was tethered to localized survival. If you didn't grow it, you didn't eat it. By the 10th century, a massive environmental shift, known as the medieval warm period, extended growing seasons. Along with improving climates, upgrades like the heavy iron plow and the three-field crop rotation allowed agricultural yields to skyrocket. At roughly the same time, powerful medieval kings like Charlemagne and later Henry II began consolidating lands and bolstering defenses. This curbed the threat of the Vikings, Magyars, and other raiders who eventually integrated. This pacification triggered a demographic boom. Because a single peasant could now suddenly produce far more than their household required, excess labor was transferred away from the farm. And with the newly infused former raiding populations, specialized urban crafts exploded, turning settlements into manufacturing hubs. This commercialization demanded a new infrastructure. Europe founded its first universities, churning out a literate bureaucratic class who could serve the expanding markets. And mobility became one of the era's new currencies. The Crusades mobilized thousands across the continent, carving corridors toward the east. To keep capital moving safely without the risk of highway robbery, the Knights Templar had, if unintendedly, pioneered banking networks, introducing Europe to letters of credit, later to be enhanced by Italian banking families. Even the mechanics of travel evolved. Europe absorbed navigational tools like the astrolabe from the Islamic Golden Age and upgraded its maps, while assimilation of Nordic shipbuilders drastically improved European fleets. For centuries, Jewish merchants, like the Radhanites, had acted as the primary intermediate between the hostile Christian and Islamic polities, but as their network faded, a massive shift began filling the void. The sudden mega-expansion of the Mongol Empire across Eurasia flattened regional borders, resulting in a safe, wildly efficient pathway across the Silk Road. By the 13th century, these gears all locked into place, supercharging international trade. At the center of this new European matrix stood strategically positioned Mediterranean port cities like Venice and Genoa. They weren't just cities, they were hyper-competitive capitalist merchant empires poised to exploit the newly connected world. Within the Venetian Empire, two brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, would become prominent and pioneering merchants. In 1253, the brothers left Venice for a deployment in Constantinople, and 1 year later, back in Venice, Niccolo's wife gave birth to a boy. More on him shortly. By 1260, the brothers realized that the Latin Empire, which had controlled Constantinople since 1204, was on the verge of bankruptcy. They liquidated their assets into gemstones and headed to the Crimean port of Soldaya. Safe in the territory of the Mongol Golden Horde, the brothers traveled to the capital of Sarai, selling their gems to the court of Berka Khan. But when they attempted to return home, a civil war between Berka and his cousin Hulagu turned the Caucasus, their most direct route, into an active war zone. They detoured through the trading oasis of Bukhara as they waited for the geopolitics to simmer. There, in 1265, an envoy from Hulagu heading to see Kublai, the Great Khan, recognized the brothers as a cultural anomaly. Playing to Kublai's wide fascination and reverence of varying cultures, the envoys invited the brothers to the Great Khan's court. While merchants by profession, the brothers were seen by the court as assets of intelligence. Fascinated by Western governance and Christianity, Kublai utilized the Polos as imperial emissaries to the Vatican. He granted them a paisa, a golden passport ensuring free logistical support across the empire, and sent them to report to the Pope and return with holy oil and 100 Christian theologians to help educate the Mongol court. In 1269, the brothers finally landed back in Venice. There, Niccolo learnt that his wife had passed away shortly after his initial departure, but had left behind a son, who he had never met. Marco. For 3 grueling years, the Polos, this time with Marco, tracked across the Silk Road, navigating thousands of miles of the high-altitude Pamir Mountains and waterless Gobi Desert. In 1274 or 1275, they finally arrived at the legendary palace of Xanadu to re-engage Kublai Khan. However, they only partially fulfilled their contract. While they managed to secure a papal letter and the requested holy oil, they showed up with exactly 0 of the 100 learned priests requested by Kublai. A 3-year papal election deadlock, the longest in Catholic history, had delayed their departure, and a brutal Mamluk invasion of Cilician Armenia terrified the few friars that the new pope did procure, causing them to panic and flee back to safety. While the Venetians had no choice but to press on empty-handed on the religious front, they did bring someone else of interest, Niccolo's son, Marco. Marco, now 21 years old, left a positive first impression, and when the Polos offered their services to Kublai Khan, he accepted. Marco, in particular, quickly learned the languages, the culture, and the customs of the land. The family was promptly employed by Kublai's court, and while their exact titles remain debated, they operated as high-ranking merchant envoys, administrators, and diplomats for the emperor. Over the next 17 years, Marco developed an incredibly deep understanding of the East, as he traveled extensively through China and the Mongol territories. He experienced things completely alien to Europe: paper currency, massive road infrastructure, an ultra-efficient imperial postal system, colossal cities, and a vast display of wealth that he described as culturally and technologically far surpassing that of medieval Europe. As a trusted diplomat, he was even assigned to the temporary governorship of various cities along his routes. Eventually, the Polos requested to return to Venice. While their initial requests were repeatedly refused by an emperor who viewed them as irreplaceable assets, the aging Kublai finally agreed on the condition that they escort the Mongol princess Kokochin to Persia to marry Ghazan, the Ilkhanate ruler. The maritime route was, shall we say, not so smooth. Plagued by disease and stranded for months by Indonesian monsoons, only a fraction of the fleet survived the voyage. But after delivering the princess, surviving a targeted robbery in Trebizond, and pressing onward, the Polos finally arrived back in Venice in 1295, 24 years after they had departed, which brings us full circle to the competitive friction of the maritime states. In 1298, during the Battle of Corzola in the Genoese-Venetian War, or perhaps Lajazzo several years earlier, Marco Polo was captured by the Genoese navy. While imprisoned in Genoa, his cellmate was a Pisan writer and poet named Rustichello. Trapped in the cell together, Marco dictated the vivid details of his journey to the east, while Rustichello documented it all. Upon their release in 1299, these accounts were compiled and published, unleashing a book that would shock Europe: The Travels of Marco Polo. Enjoying so far? Give us a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know and keeps this kind of content coming. While Muslim traders had been moving back and forth connecting the goods of the East to Europe for centuries, there had never been a detailed account of the continent's structure and wealth in the West. As such, the book's spread and popularity were immediate, but also a cultural anomaly. Because Gutenberg's printing press wouldn't be invented for another century and a half, every copy of the Travels of Marco Polo was transcribed by hand. Yet it still managed to become a medieval blockbuster, spreading across the continent in dozens of different languages. This, however, also created a risk. As scribes rushed to reproduce the text, errors, embellishments, and translation blunders inevitably crept in, only fueling the deep skepticism of those who already believed that the narrative was a fabrication. Society simply couldn't comprehend a civilization that dwarfed Western Europe in scale, cleanliness, and infrastructure. Skeptics treated the description of quote unquote stones that burned like wood, likely coal, and cities of millions as pure fantasy, labeling the work Il Milione, which was even later pejoratively referenced to mean a book of a million lies. The skepticism was so deep that even as Marco lay on his deathbed in 1324, a priest and family members begged him to recant his falsehoods. Marco famously fired back, "I have not told half of what I saw." Within a few decades, Europe began to come around. Cartographers began lifting names and routes straight from the texts to assemble maps, such as the Catalan Atlas. Merchants realized that Pax Mongolia had secured an organized commercial corridor spanning an entire continent. Soon, Marco's retelling transformed the East from a mythical land of folklore into a concrete economic reality that European trade networks immediately scrambled to exploit. Marco Polo's accounts are typically remembered for their economic repercussions, but his book has also led many within the Christian community to question, what if? The Polos already had the air of Kublai Khan, likely the world's most powerful man, and if 100 Christian scholars had joined in on the return journey, the religious layout of Asia might have looked very different today. Others, however, take a more skeptical view, not just of the possible religious ramifications, but even questioning the extent to which any of Polo's retelling was witnessed firsthand. Certain claims, or lacking details, might indicate that not all was what it seemed. He claimed to help win the siege of Xiangyang, but the battle likely ended before he even arrived. He claimed to be the governor of Yangzhou, yet Chinese records contain zero mentions of him, or any mentions of his existence at all. And, for a supposed imperial insider, his texts missing fundamental cultural staples like chopsticks, tea, calligraphy, and the Great Wall, all wildly alien to European culture, just feels like a massive historical red flag. But in his defense, Kublai Khan's court routinely assigned officials local Persian or Mongol names, which could easily explain away the lack of a paper trail for a quote-unquote Marco Polo. More importantly, his descriptions of specific regional customs, wildlife, and the intricate layouts of Hangzhou's canals or other city structures are so brutally accurate and perfectly match other reliable sources that many historians believe no outsider could fake that level of detail. But there were two true smoking guns. His family's inventory included a paisa, a rare imperial passport ensuring high-level security clearance across the Mongol Empire, and a bokhta, a headdress almost exclusively worn by Mongol royalty. Neither of these were simply given to merchants, and heavily indicate that he was in the upper echelons of the Mongol machine. Yet, whether his logs were fully experienced or brilliantly curated is essentially beside the point. The Travels of Marco Polo remains one of the most profoundly influential books ever written. Period. The book sent Western Europe into an absolute commercial frenzy. The continent's insular worldview was shattered, causing trade with Asia via the Mediterranean to explode. This economic rush turned the Italian maritime republics into wildly wealthy global powerhouses, creating a massive influx of capital that almost directly financed the Italian Renaissance. This surge in Asian demand also triggered decades of aggressive European experimentation across both land and sea. But when the Mongol Empire collapsed in the mid-14th century, the overland Silk Road fractured with it, slamming the terrestrial door to Asia shut. If Europe wanted access to the immense wealth Marco had detailed, they would have to find it by sea, ultimately propelling human history into an unimaginably important historic era, the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus famously crossed the Atlantic with an annotated copy of Polo's book, and Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation to find an alternate route to the Spice Islands stemmed largely from Marco's descriptions of Indonesian gemstones and spices. Ultimately, Marco Polo's legacy is not defined by perfect journalistic accuracy, but by its sheer historical impact. By providing an ambitious Europe with a vivid economic blueprint of the East, his prison cell dictations inadvertently laid the foundation for the modern world, transforming isolated continents into a permanently interconnected global economy. I hope you enjoyed this video and found this period in history both informative and enlightening. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you can join us for another video. Thanks for watching.